For my birthday, my mother-in-law gifted me divorce papers at a crowded restaurant while my husband filmed my reaction. Little did they know, I was hiding a secret job offer that would turn my public shaming into my greatest victory. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. The pink envelope felt heavier than a stack of greeting cards as I held it under the dim restaurant lights. Happy birthday was scripted in silver across the front, little butterflies dancing around the edges of the expensive paper. I looked at my mother-in-law, Margaret, whose smile was so sharp it could have drawn blood. David, my husband of 2 years, sat beside her with his phone raised, his camera lens focused right on my eyes. I pulled the tab, the paper tearing with a crisp, jagged sound that seemed to echo through the entire dining room. I didn't find a gift card or a heartfelt note inside. I found a petition for dissolution of marriage. Bold black letters at the top of the first page announced the end of my life as I knew it. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the stomach, a cold, hard weight that made the air in Romano's restaurant feel too thin to breathe. Margaret leaned forward, her pearls clicking against the edge of the table. We thought it was time for David to move on to someone more suitable, she said, her voice carrying to the nearby tables. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry, even though I could feel the heat of 100 eyes on my back. My coworkers stood frozen by the service window, and Mrs. Patterson, my Tuesday regular, stopped her fork halfway to her mouth. This was my workplace. This was the place where I had spent 3 years working double shifts to support David while he built his accounting practice. Margaret had chosen this specific stage for my public execution because she wanted to see me break in front of the people who respected me. David's thumb remained steady on his phone screen, recording every second of my humiliation for their family group chat. He didn't look like the man I had married. He looked like a spectator at a sport. I reached for the pen Margaret had tucked into the envelope flap. My fingers didn't tremble as I clicked it. I flipped to the last page, scrawled my signature across the line, and slid the documents back toward her. The satisfaction on Margaret's face flickered for a split second. She had expected a scene, a breakdown, or at least a plea for mercy. Instead, I stood up and smoothed the fabric of my navy dress. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady enough to surprise even me. "This is the most honest thing you have ever done for me." I looked at David, who was finally lowering his phone, his expression shifting from excitement to confusion. He didn't say a word as I turned my back on them. I walked toward the kitchen, the bell above the door chiming as a new group of customers entered, completely unaware that a marriage had just died in the corner booth. I needed to get to my locker. I needed to grab the one thing Margaret didn't know I had. 3 days ago, I had caught Margaret hunched over these very papers at our kitchen table. She had tried to hide them in that festive envelope, calling me dear for the first time in our relationship. That sudden, artificial sweetness had set off every alarm bell in my head. Margaret had never used my name if she could help it. I was always she or David's wife. Seeing her celebrate my birthday with red ink and legal jargon had been the final proof that I would never be enough for them. They saw me as the service industry girl, a temporary embarrassment that David needed to outgrow. They didn't realize that while they were planning my destruction, I had been building an escape hatch. I reached into my locker and pulled out the folded job offer from Grand Plaza Hotel. It was a guest services coordinator position with a starting salary of $45,000 annually. It came with full benefits, management training, and most importantly, a furnished apartment 3 hours away from this city. I tucked the letter into my purse and walked back out into the dining room. Margaret and David were still sitting there, whispering urgently to each other. They looked like they were waiting for the second act of a play that had already ended. I stopped at the head of the table, making sure Mr. Romano and the rest of the staff could hear me. Before I go, I have an announcement of my own, I said. The restaurant went silent again. I have accepted a management position at the Grand Plaza. I start in 2 weeks, and the relocation package includes my own housing. Margaret's mouth opened, but no sound came out. David stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "You're leaving?" he asked, his voice cracking. I looked at the divorce papers sitting between them, signed and sealed. "You already made sure of that, David." I turned to Mr. Romano, who was watching with tears in his weathered eyes. "Thank you for everything," I told him. Then I walked out into the cool night air, leaving the recording of my humiliation to play to an empty audience. I drove away from the restaurant with the windows down, the wind whipping through my hair. For 2 years, I had tried to shrink myself to fit into their narrow world. I had bought clothes I couldn't afford and apologized for a job that paid our rent. I had listened to Margaret pray for the end of my marriage while I stood in the hallway, my heart breaking in silence. Now the silence felt like freedom. I pulled into our driveway one last time, the headlights cutting through the darkness of the suburban street. I had 2 hours to pack a life into a suitcase before David got home. I didn't need the furniture or the wedding china. I just needed my dignity and that job offer letter. As I shoved my clothes into a bag, I realized I had left my wedding ring on the table next to the half-eaten birthday cake. The house felt like a stranger's museum. Every photo on the mantel was of David's family, Margaret always standing at the center. I realized then that I had been an extra in a movie about her son's life. I grabbed my laptop and the stack of community college textbooks that Margaret had called a waste of time. My grades were all A's, proving I had the intelligence she claimed I lacked. I was halfway to the door when the front lock turned. David was home, and he wasn't alone. David stood in the foyer, his face flushed and his tie loosened. Margaret was right behind him, her eyes scanning the room like a general assessing a battlefield. "You can't just walk out like this," David said, stepping into my path. "We need to talk about the logistics." "Logistics?" I repeated, gripping the handle of my suitcase. "You just served me divorce papers at my birthday dinner while filming it for your mother's amusement." "The logistics are finished," I signed. "You won. Now get out of my way." Margaret stepped forward, her voice dropping into that low, poisonous tone she used when she thought she was in control. "Don't be dramatic, Jennifer. We were going to give you a generous settlement if you behaved properly. But this stunt at the restaurant was beneath you." I laughed, and the sound startled both of them. "You think I care about your settlement?" I asked. "I just told you I have a career waiting for me. I have a salary of $45,000 and a place to live that doesn't smell like your judgment." I moved to push past David, but he grabbed my arm. His grip was tight, his face twisting with a sudden, desperate anger. "You're not going anywhere until we discuss the house. This property is in my name, and I want you out tonight." I looked down at his hand on my sleeve and then up at his eyes. "I'm already leaving, David, and since you recorded everything tonight, I'm sure your lawyer will be thrilled to explain how a judge feels about emotional cruelty and public humiliation." Margaret's expression shifted. The mention of a lawyer and a judge hit her where it hurt, her reputation. She prided herself on being a pillar of the community, a woman of standards and grace. The idea of that video being played in a courtroom made her skin turn pale. "David, let her go," she snapped. "If she wants to live in a hotel apartment and work for tips, let her." David released my arm, his chest heaving. He looked at the suitcase as if it were a ticking bomb. "You'll be back," he spat. "You won't last a month in the real world without my income. You're just a waitress, Jennifer. You'll always just be a waitress." I didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. I walked out the door, tossed my bag into the trunk of my car, and drove toward the highway. I didn't have a plan for where to stay tonight, but I had a credit card with a $2,000 limit and a tank full of gas. I stopped at a motel on the edge of the city, the neon sign flickering against the damp pavement. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner, but it was the most peaceful place I had been in years. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my laptop. I had dozens of messages on social media. My coworkers from Romano's were cheering for me. Even some of the regular customers had found my profile to send words of support. But there was one message that stood out. It was from Emma, David's sister. "I thought you should know," it read. "Mom is already calling people, telling them you had a breakdown and that David had to end it for his own safety. She's deleting the video." My heart hammered against my ribs. Margaret was already rewriting the history of my life, turning me into the villain to protect her precious son's image. I realized then that signing the papers wasn't enough. If I didn't fight back, she would follow me to my new job with her lies. She would try to poison my future before it even started. I looked at my phone and remembered the one thing they had forgotten in their excitement to destroy me. David hadn't been the only one with the phone out. The entire restaurant had been watching. And in the digital age, a public execution never stays private for long. I reached out to Tony, the busboy at Romano's. He was 19, tech-savvy, and he hated Margaret with a passion. "Tony," I messaged, "did anyone else record the dinner tonight?" 5 minutes later, my inbox pinged. It was a file from the restaurant's security system, along with a handheld video taken by one of the servers. It showed everything. It showed Margaret's triumphant smirk as she handed over the pink envelope. It showed David's steady hand as he filmed my pain. And it showed me, standing tall and signing my way to freedom. I didn't post it. Not yet. I needed to get to the Grand Plaza first. I needed to be settled in my new life before I pulled the trigger on theirs. I spent the next 2 weeks in a blur of packing, paperwork, and driving. I officially resigned from Romano's, and the goodbye party was the first time I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. Mr. Romano gave me a $500 bonus and a hug that felt like a blessing. "You're going to run that hotel one day," he whispered. "Don't let those people make you feel small again." I drove toward the mountains, toward the Grand Plaza, and toward a version of myself I hadn't seen in a very long time. The Grand Plaza Hotel was a palace of marble and glass. When I walked into the lobby for my first day of orientation, I felt like an imposter in my cheap blazer. But then I saw Jessica Martinez, the HR director who had hired me. She took one look at me and smiled. "Jennifer Walsh," she said, using my maiden name. "I've been looking forward to this. We have your keys ready. Your apartment is on the 10th floor of the employee wing. You have a view of the park." As I stood in my new home, looking out at the city lights, my phone buzzed. It was a text from David. "Mom is threatening to sue you for defamation because of what you told the staff at Romano's. You need to call her and apologize." I looked at the video file on my laptop, the cursor hovering over the upload button. I wasn't going to apologize. I was going to give Margaret exactly what she wanted, a public acknowledging of the truth. My first month at the Grand Plaza was a trial by fire. I wasn't just checking people in, I was coordinating high-stakes guest services for a clientele that expected perfection. I was handling $10,000 events and managing requests for everything from private jets to specific brands of mineral water. Every day, I used the skills I had learned at Romano's, the ability to read a room, the patience to handle an angry customer, and the stamina to stay on my feet for 12 hours. Jessica watched me closely, often pulling me aside to offer a piece of advice or a word of encouragement. Your instincts are incredible, she told me during a particularly busy Friday shift. You see the problem before the guest even mentions it. That's something you can't teach. While I was building my reputation at the hotel, the war with David's family was simmering in the background. Margaret hadn't sued me yet, but she was busy. I heard through mutual friends that she was hosting a dinner party to announce David's engagement to his ex-girlfriend, a girl named Sarah, who had the business degree and family pedigree Margaret had always wanted for me. They had been separated for less than 6 weeks, and they were already moving on. It was a calculated move to show everyone that I had been the problem, a temporary lapse in judgment that was now being corrected. The news stung, but it didn't break me. It just confirmed that I had been a placeholder in a life that wasn't mine. The financial pressure was the next hurdle. David had frozen our joint savings account, claiming that the $5,000 inside was his earned income and that I had no right to it. I was living paycheck to paycheck, my new salary of $45,000 being eaten up by the initial costs of moving and the credit card debt I had accumulated, trying to look professional for Margaret. I was eating ramen in a $500,000 apartment, but I didn't care. I was earning my own way. I spent my nights studying for the management certification courses the hotel provided. I was determined to prove that a community college education was just the beginning. Then, the first real blow landed. I received a formal letter from a law firm representing Margaret and David. They were accusing me of theft, claiming I had taken family heirlooms when I left the house. It was a blatant lie. I had left with nothing but my clothes and my books. They were trying to build a criminal record against me, something that would get me fired from the Grand Plaza. The hotel had a strict policy about the character of its employees, and a theft charge would be the end of my career. I sat in my office, the letter trembling in my hand. They weren't just satisfied with taking my marriage. They wanted to take my future. I went to Jessica and showed her the letter. I expected her to be disappointed, or perhaps to tell me that the hotel couldn't be involved in my personal drama. Instead, she sat back in her chair and looked at the letterhead. "I know this firm," she said, her voice cold. "They handle Margaret's estate. Jennifer, do you have any proof of what you took when you left?" I told her about the video Tony had sent me, the one from the restaurant. I also told her that I had taken photos of my packed bags before I walked out of the house. I had done it out of a lingering sense of paranoia, a habit I had developed living with Margaret's constant accusations. Jessica nodded. "Send those to me. And Jennifer, we have a legal department here at the hotel for a reason. We protect our assets, and right now, you are a very valuable asset to this company." For the first time, I felt the power of a large organization standing behind me. Margaret had her country club friends and her family lawyer, but I had a luxury hotel group with a national presence. We didn't just send a reply, we sent a warning. Our legal team pointed out that filing a false police report was a felony, and that we had video evidence of the night in question that could be shared with the local media. The theft accusations vanished overnight, but Margaret wasn't done. She decided to take the battle to social media. She posted a long, tearful status about the heartbreak of a mother seeing her son betrayed by an ungrateful wife. She didn't use my name, but the hints were unmistakable. She talked about the service girl who had used them for their money and then ran away when things got difficult. The comments were filled with her friends calling me a gold digger and a social climber. It was a public shaming designed to destroy my standing in the community I had left behind. I realized then that I couldn't keep running. If I wanted to be free of them, I had to stop being the victim and start being the architect of their downfall. I called Tony again. "Tony," I said, "that video from the server's phone. Is it still on your cloud?" He told me it was. "I want you to send it to a specific list of people," I said. I gave him the email addresses of the local newspapers, the country club board of directors, and Margaret's favorite charity organizers. I didn't want it to go viral for fame. I wanted it to land exactly where it would do the most damage to her social position. The next morning, I woke up to a world that had shifted. The video of the birthday ambush was everywhere in our old town. People weren't talking about the ungrateful wife anymore. They were talking about the mother-in-law who handed out divorce papers like party favors. They were talking about the husband who filmed his wife's heartbreak instead of defending her. The social ladder Margaret had spent her life climbing was suddenly covered in grease. And I was just getting started. I had a management meeting at 9, and for the first time, I walked into that room knowing I wasn't just a survivor. I was a winner. The fallout from the video was spectacular. Margaret's charity gala was canceled after 3 of the major sponsors pulled out, citing the negative publicity. David's accounting firm lost 2 high-profile clients who didn't want their finances handled by a man with such a public lack of integrity. My phone was blowing up with apologies from people who had previously blocked me. Even Aunt Patricia, the one who had told me to go back to school to be worthy of David, sent a message saying she was disgusted by what she had seen. The tide had turned, but the victory felt hollow. I realized that as long as I was focused on their destruction, I wasn't fully living my own life. I decided to stop checking the news from my old town. I blocked David and Margaret on everything. I threw myself into my work at the Grand Plaza, taking on more responsibility and volunteering for the graveyard shifts to learn the operations from every angle. I was promoted to Assistant Guest Services Manager within 4 months, my salary jumping to $52,000. I was finally building a savings account that didn't have David's name on it. I bought a new car, a modest but reliable sedan, and I started taking weekend trips to explore the mountains. I was finding out who Jennifer Walsh was when she wasn't being told she was a disappointment. Then, a familiar face appeared in the lobby. It was Sarah, David's new fiancée. She was staying at the hotel for a business conference, and she looked exactly as Margaret had described her, polished, professional, and perfect. My heart hammered against my ribs as I saw her approaching the guest services desk. I could have walked away, could have asked another manager to handle her, but I didn't. I stood my ground, my name tag shining on my lapel. "Good afternoon," I said, my voice calm and professional. "How can I help you today?" Sarah froze. She looked at my name tag and then at my face. "Jennifer?" she whispered. "I didn't know you worked here." I smiled, the kind of professional smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "I'm the assistant manager of guest services," I said. "Is there a problem with your reservation?" She looked around at the opulent lobby, the crystal chandeliers, and the staff moving with military precision. She looked back at me, and I saw a flicker of something that wasn't condescension. It was doubt. "Margaret told me you were working as a waitress in a diner," she said. I leaned forward slightly. "Margaret has a tendency to see what she wants to see," I told her. "I hope your stay is comfortable. If you need anything, my office is right through those doors." Sarah didn't ask for any extras. She didn't complain about the room. She stayed for 3 days, and every time she saw me, she looked like she was seeing a ghost. On her last night, she came to my desk. "I saw the video," she said quietly. "I asked David about it, and he told me it was a joke that went wrong. But after seeing you here, after seeing how you work, I don't think it was a joke." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The truth was written in the way I carried myself. Sarah checked out the next morning, and as she left, she handed me a small note. It had David's new office number and a single sentence. "He's miserable, and Margaret is blaming him for the loss of her reputation. You were the lucky one. I crumpled the note and tossed it into the trash. I didn't care if David was miserable. I didn't care if Margaret was losing her mind. I was busy preparing for the hotel's annual gala, an event that would bring in the city's most influential people. The gala was my biggest challenge yet. I was in charge of the VIP seating and the personal request for the keynote speakers. It was a $250,000 event, and the pressure was immense. I worked 20 hours straight, fueled by coffee and the sheer adrenaline of proving I belonged in this world. Everything went perfectly. The flowers were fresh, the music was the right volume, and the guests were delighted. At the end of the night, the hotel owner, a man who rarely spoke to anyone below director level, walked up to me. "You handled that rowdy group from the tech firm with a lot of grace," he said. "Jessica tells me you have a bright future here." I went back to my apartment that night and sat on my balcony. I looked at the city and realized that I had achieved more in 6 months than I had in 2 years with David. I was a manager. I was respected. I was financially independent, and I was about to receive the ultimate validation. Jessica called me into her office the next Monday. "Jennifer, we're opening a new luxury property in the city," she said. "It's a boutique hotel, very exclusive. We need a guest services manager to head the department. The salary is $65,000, and it comes with a performance bonus. I want you to apply." I felt a surge of pride so strong it made my eyes sting. I was being headhunted for a major role. I spent the next week preparing my presentation, detailing my ideas for a personalized guest experience. I walked into the interview with the confidence of a woman who knew her worth. I got the job. I was moving to the heart of the city, to a brand new office and a brand new life. But before I left the Grand Plaza, I had one final piece of business to take care of. I had received a notification from my lawyer. The divorce was final. All I had to do was pick up the papers. I walked into the lawyer's office to sign the final decree. The room was quiet, filled with the smell of old paper and leather. David was already there, sitting across from his attorney. He looked older than I remembered. His suit was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He looked up when I entered, and for a second, I saw the man I had once loved. But then I remembered the camera phone. I remembered the pink butterflies. I remembered the silence when his mother called me a waitress. I sat down and signed the last page without looking at him. "Is that it?" David asked as the lawyer gathered the folders. "We're just done?" I looked at him then. "We were done at the restaurant, David. This is just the paperwork catching up to reality." He stood up, following me to the door. "Jennifer, wait. Sarah left me. She said she couldn't marry into a family that treats people the way we treated you. Mom she's not doing well. She's been blacklisted from the club." I stopped and turned to face him. "David, I don't want to hear about Margaret. I don't want to hear about your life. I spent 2 years being a character in your story. Now, I'm the author of my own." I walked out of the office and into the bright afternoon sun. I had my maiden name back. I had my career. I had a new apartment waiting for me in the city. I felt like I was floating. I drove to the new boutique hotel, the Azure, to meet my new team. It was a stunning building, all black steel and floor-to-ceiling glass. This was my kingdom. I spent the afternoon touring the construction site, imagining where each guest would sit and how we would make them feel like royalty. I was a manager now. I was the one who made the decisions. My first week at the Azure was a whirlwind of hiring and training. I was looking for people like me, hardworking, observant, and resilient. I hired 2 former waitresses because I knew they had the backbone for the job. I was building a culture of respect, the kind of respect I had never received from David's family. I was making $65,000 a year, and with my bonus, I was looking at close to $80,000. I was a success story, and I knew it. But the past has a way of trying to claw its way back. I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I usually ignored them, but something made me answer. "Jennifer," a voice whispered. It was Margaret. She sounded small, her usual booming authority replaced by a wavering desperation. "I'm in the hospital," she said. "I had a minor heart episode. David is busy with work, and I have no one to help me with the discharge paperwork. I know we had our differences, but you were always so good with the details." I sat in my plush office, looking at the city skyline. I remembered Margaret hunched over the divorce papers with her red pen. I remembered her predatory smile. "I'm sorry to hear you're unwell, Margaret," I said, my voice as cold as the glass in front of me. "But I think you should call David's accountant, or perhaps one of your friends from the country club. I'm a busy woman. I have a hotel to run." I hung up the phone and felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't revenge. It was just a lack of interest. She didn't have power over me anymore. Her health, her reputation, her life, they were no longer my responsibility. I went back to my staff meeting, focusing on the future. The Azure opened to rave reviews. We were at 90% occupancy within the first month. I was featured in a local business magazine as a rising star in the hospitality industry. The photo showed me standing in the lobby, looking confident and professional. I sent a copy to Mr. Romano with a note of thanks. He sent back a picture of the magazine displayed prominently on the counter of the restaurant. That was the only validation I needed. I was living my dream, and the nightmares of the past were fading away. Then, the final twist landed. I was at a networking event for young professionals when I met a man named Marcus. He was a developer, smart, and kind, and he didn't care about my past. We started dating, and for the first time, I was in a relationship where I was an equal. We were sitting at dinner one night when he asked me about the video. "I saw it on a blog about workplace ethics," he said. "You were incredible. How did you stay so calm?" I looked at him and realized that I didn't need to hide anymore. "I stayed calm because I knew I was better than they were," I said, and I was right. 1 year after the birthday ambush, I received a package at the hotel. It was a small silver frame. Inside was a photo of David and Margaret standing in front of their house. The house had a for sale sign in the yard. There was no note, but I knew what it meant. They were losing their home. The loss of clients and the social isolation had finally caught up to them. They were shrinking while I was growing. I put the frame in a drawer and went back to work. I had a VIP guest arriving in 10 minutes, and I wanted to make sure everything was perfect. As I walked through the lobby, I caught my reflection in the glass. I was 32, single, successful, and completely free. And that was the greatest gift of all. The transition to the Azure Boutique Hotel felt like stepping onto the bridge of a sleek, modern starship. I had traded the sprawling chaos of the Grand Plaza for a space where every detail was curated and every guest was a high-stakes relationship. My salary had climbed to $65,000, providing a level of financial security that made the struggles of the previous year feel like a bad dream. I was no longer the girl checking credit card balances at the grocery store. I was the woman who signed the expense reports. My new office was a sanctuary of glass and steel, overlooking the pulsing heart of the city. From this height, the toxic influence of Margaret and David felt small, like a storm happening in a distant valley. But the corporate world has its own set of predators. While I was no longer fighting a mother-in-law for my dignity, I was now navigating the territorial waters of established management. My rapid rise had ruffled feathers among the veterans at the Azure. During my first month, a series of subtle obstacles began to appear. Supplies for VIP arrivals were mysteriously delayed, and my directives to the concierge team were often misinterpreted by the overnight staff. I knew the signs of a campaign when I saw them. This wasn't the amateur cruelty of a family betrayal, it was professional sabotage. The source was a man named Victor, the longtime operations manager who had expected his own protege to get the guest services role. He treated me with a polished, artificial respect that was uncomfortably similar to Margaret's dear phase. At the Tuesday executive meeting, Victor presented a report on guest satisfaction that strategically omitted the glowing reviews from my first 2 weeks. "Jennifer is still finding her footing," he said with a practiced sigh, clicking through a slide that highlighted a single minor complaint about a slow valet. I didn't let the heat rise to my face. I had learned the hard way that when people try to frame you as a failure, you don't argue. You provide data. I waited for him to finish, then slid a folder across the mahogany table. "Actually, Victor, if you look at the real-time internal dashboard, our satisfaction scores have risen by 12% since the relaunch," I said, my voice steady and professional. The valet issue was a mechanical failure in the lift, which was documented and resolved within 6 minutes. The room went quiet as the general manager scanned my data. The truth was my armor. That evening, as I was closing my office, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was a message from David's personal account, titled Final Request. My thumb hovered over the delete button, but the first line caught my eye. He wasn't asking for a reconciliation this time. He was asking for a loan. He claimed that Margaret's medical bills from her heart episode had drained his liquid assets, and the bank was threatening to foreclose on the family home. The irony was the physical weight. The man who had mocked my work ethic and hidden our joint savings was now begging for the money I had earned while he was trying to destroy me. I didn't reply. I couldn't. Helping him would be like handing a weapon back to a person who had already shot me. Instead, I walked down to the lobby to oversee the arrival of a high-profile diplomatic delegation. I moved through the marble space with the quiet authority of someone who had earned her place. I was no longer an embarrassment to a suburban family. I was a key player in a multi-million-dollar operation. As the diplomats arrived, I caught Victor watching me from the shadows of the mezzanine. He looked frustrated. He realized that I wasn't a waitress playing dress-up. I was a professional, and I was exactly where I belonged. The night was long and demanding, but as the last car pulled away from the porte-cochere, I felt a sense of exhilaration. I was 33 hours away from my first real vacation in 3 years. I had booked a week in the Caribbean, a trip I was paying for in full, with no one to ask permission from and no one to judge my spending. But as I walked toward the staff elevator, a frantic concierge stopped me. "Ms. Walsh, there's a woman in the lounge refusing to leave. She says she's family." My pulse spiked, a reflexive survival instinct. I walked into the dimly lit lounge, my heels clicking sharply on the hardwood. Sitting in a velvet chair, looking older and more haggard than I had ever seen her, was Emma. She wasn't filming this time. She looked like she had been crying for hours. When she saw me, she didn't sneer or drop a passive-aggressive comment. She stood up, her hands trembling. "Jennifer, please," she whispered. "David's been arrested." The silence in the lounge was thick enough to choke on. Emma's words hung in the air, a devastating reversal for the family that had once looked down on everyone from their mountain of perceived moral superiority. I led her to my private office, my professional mask firmly in place, despite the chaos in my chest. "Sit down, Emma," I said, closing the door. Tell me exactly what happened and why you're bringing this to my workplace. The story spilled out of her in jagged pieces. In his desperation to cover Margaret's medical debts and save the house, David had begun borrowing from his client's escrow accounts. He thought he could move the money back before anyone noticed, but a routine audit by a major firm had caught the discrepancies. It was embezzlement. The man who had once been ashamed of my service industry job was now facing felony charges for stealing from the very people he had bragged about representing. Mom is a wreck, Emma sobbed, her expensive mascara running down her cheeks. The lawyers want a $50,000 retainer just to start the defense. David said you might. That you were doing so well now. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking. The stakes ladder of their life had finally collapsed. They had gone from private disapproval to social blacklisting, and now they had reached the final rung, public and legal ruin. Emma, I'm sorry for the position you're in, I said, my voice devoid of the anger I expected to feel. But I think you've forgotten how I left that house. I left with a suitcase and a job offer that your mother called pathetic. You and David recorded my humiliation for your entertainment. You stood by while they tried to frame me for theft to get me fired from the Grand Plaza. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto hers. I don't have $50,000 for a man who tried to destroy my life. And even if I did, I wouldn't spend it on a thief. Emma's face shifted from desperation to a flicker of the old resentment. We're family, Jennifer. 2 years of marriage has to count for something. I stood up, indicating that the meeting was over. It counted for a lot, Emma. It taught me exactly who not to trust. You should leave now before I have security escort you out. I watched her walk away. Her shoulders slumped, a shadow of the girl who had once sent me articles about ambitious women to make me feel small. I went back to my apartment that night, but sleep was impossible. The news of David's arrest hit the local business wires by morning. The accounting scandal was the talk of the industry. I saw his mugshot on a news site, a grainy, defeated image that looked nothing like the man I had married. Margaret's name was mentioned as a close associate, whose medical expenses were the catalyst for the crimes. Their reputation was officially dead. I spent my vacation in the Caribbean, but I didn't spend it gloating. I spent it swimming in the turquoise water and reading books that had nothing to do with hospitality or management. I was purging the last of the poison. When I returned to the Azure, I was met with a surprise. The general manager called me into his office. Victor was there too, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the floor. Jennifer, the GM said, smiling broadly, while you were away, we had a visit from the board. They were incredibly impressed with how you handled the diplomatic delegation and the subsequent rise in our corporate booking scores. Victor has decided to transition to our regional acquisitions team. He paused, letting the implications sink in. We'd like to offer you the position of operations director for the Azure. The salary is $95,000, with a significant equity stake in the property. I felt the world tilt. At 34, I was being offered the top operational role in one of the city's most prestigious hotels. I looked at Victor, who managed a tight, pained nod. I had outworked the sabotage, outlived the betrayal, and now I was out-earning the people who had tried to define my ceiling. I accept, I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that made me realize I hadn't just survived the divorce. I had used it as fuel to launch myself into a life I hadn't known was possible. As I walked out of the office, my assistant handed me a legal envelope. This arrived by courier, Ms. Walsh. It's from a state correctional facility. I took the envelope to my desk and opened it. It was a letter from David. He had been sentenced to 3 years. He wanted me to visit him. He said he finally understood what I had gone through. I looked at the letter, then at the view of the city I now helped manage. I didn't feel a surge of hate. I just felt finished. Being the operations director of the Azure was like conducting a symphony where the instruments were made of crystal and the audience was the most demanding in the world. My days were a marathon of strategy meetings, financial audits, and VIP walkthroughs. I was no longer just managing guests. I was managing a brand. My equity stake meant that the hotel's success was my success, and in my first 6 months, we broke every revenue record in the company's history. I moved into a high-rise penthouse, a place with floor-to-ceiling windows that made me feel like I was living in the clouds. I had a personal trainer, a wardrobe of tailored suits, and a social circle of people who valued my intelligence and my drive. But the most important thing I had was peace. The constant, buzzing anxiety that Margaret had planted in my brain, the feeling that I was always one mistake away from being unworthy, was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, unshakable confidence. One rainy Tuesday, a woman arrived at the front desk asking for me. She didn't have an appointment, and she refused to give her name to the assistant. When I walked out to the lobby, I found Sarah, David's ex-fiancée, standing near the grand piano. She looked different, softer, more tired. She held a small, leather-bound book in her hands. "I'm sorry to bother you at work, Jennifer," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "but I couldn't leave the state without giving you this." She handed me the book. It was an old family ledger, something I recognized from Margaret's property documents drawer. When I broke things off with David, I took this by mistake. "I think you should see the entries from the month before your 31st birthday." I took the ledger to my office and opened it. My heart stopped. Margaret hadn't just been preparing divorce papers. She had been systematically diverting the money I had earned at Romano's, the money I had given David for joint investments, into a private account in her own name. There were thousands of dollars accounted for, every cent of my overtime and tips that I thought was going toward our future home, now sitting in a trust for David's next life. The betrayal was deeper than I had ever imagined. They hadn't just wanted me gone, they had wanted to rob me on the way out. I called my attorney. The karmic justice of David's arrest was about to become legal justice. With the ledger as evidence, we filed a civil suit for fraud and conversion. Because David was already incarcerated and the accounts were in Margaret's name, the legal pressure landed squarely on her. She had spent her life protecting her assets from the service girl, and now she was being forced to hand them over to me under the threat of criminal charges for financial elder abuse and fraud. The deposition was held in a sterile conference room. Margaret arrived in a wheelchair, looking frail and diminished, her pearls the only thing that remained of her old armor. When she saw me walk in, she didn't call me dear. She wouldn't even look at me. My lawyer laid out the entries from the ledger, the bank transfers, and the recorded video of the birthday dinner. "We are prepared to file criminal charges, Mrs. Walsh," my lawyer said calmly, "or you can sign over the deed to the suburban property and the remaining funds in the trust to my client as restitution." Margaret's hand shook as she took the pen. It was the same brand of pen she had handed me at the restaurant. She signed the documents in a jagged, desperate script. She was losing everything: her house, her money, and the son she had tried so hard to protect from a wife like me. As she was wheeled out of the room, she looked up at me for 1 second. I saw the fear in her eyes, but I also saw something else. A realization that she had been the architect of her own nightmare. I didn't keep the house. I sold it within 48 hours of the title transfer. I didn't want the ghost of those 2 years anywhere near me. I took the proceeds, nearly $300,000, and established a scholarship fund at the community college where I had gotten my start. It was named the Jennifer Walsh Foundation for Service Industry Professionals. It was designed to help women like me get the education they needed to bridge the gap that people like Margaret claimed were impossible to cross. The day the foundation was officially launched, I went back to Romano's. It was a quiet afternoon, the smell of garlic and basil filling the air, just like it always had. Mr. Romano was behind the counter, looking a little older, but still wearing his flour-dusted apron. When he saw me, he didn't just smile. He walked around the counter and hugged me. "I saw the news, Jennifer," he said, pulling back to look at me with tears in his eyes. "The director of operations. I told you, didn't I?" I looked around the restaurant, at the red vinyl booths where I had served my first table and signed my divorce papers. I felt a profound sense of gratitude for this place. It hadn't been a dead end. It had been the forge where my character was shaped. "You were right about everything, Mr. Romano," I said. I handed him a check for $10,000, a donation to help him renovate the kitchen and give Tony a management raise. I walked out of the restaurant and into the sunlight, my phone buzzing with a message from the Azure. There was a new project on the horizon, a new challenge to meet. I was ready. 18 months after the night at Romano's, I stood on the stage of the City Convention Center. I was receiving the Hospitality Executive of the Year award, an honor usually reserved for people with Ivy League degrees and decades of tenure. The audience was a sea of black ties and evening gowns, the most powerful business leaders in the state. Among them were people who had once seen the viral video of my humiliation and wondered if I would ever recover. I looked at the crystal award in my hand, its facets catching the light. My speech was short. I didn't talk about betrayal or revenge. I talked about value. "We are often told that our potential is defined by our current position," I said, my voice echoing through the silent hall. "But the skills of service, empathy, resilience, and the ability to find a solution under pressure are the foundation of every great leader. I am here today because I stopped asking for permission to be worthy and started recognizing that I already was." The standing ovation lasted for 3 minutes. As I walked off the stage, Jessica Martinez was waiting for me. She was now the regional vice president, and she looked at me with a pride that felt more like family than anything I had experienced in my marriage. "You've come a long way from that first interview, Jennifer," she said. I smiled, thinking of the navy dress and the trembling hands in my car. "I'm just getting started, Jessica." I had one final stop to make before the night ended. I drove to the state prison, the cold, gray walls a stark contrast to the luxury of the gala. It was visiting hours. I sat behind the glass, waiting. When David was let in, he looked broken. The 3 years had stripped away the last of his entitlement. He looked at my evening gown, then at my face. "I didn't think you'd come," he said, his voice hollow. "I saw the magazine cover in the library. You look like a different person." "I'm the same person, David," I said quietly. "I just stopped letting your family tell me I was small. I came here to tell you that the restitution is complete. The house is sold, the trust is gone, and the foundation is funded. I am officially closing the book on us." "And Mom?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Margaret is in a high-quality assisted living facility," I told him. "The sale of the house provided enough for her care, but nothing more. She has her room, her books, and her memories. I hope they're enough for her." I stood up to leave. "Jennifer, wait," he called out, his hands pressing against the glass. "I'm sorry. I should have turned off the camera. I should have defended you." I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt nothing but a distant, quiet pity. "You should have loved me more than you feared her," I said, "but I'm glad you didn't. If you had, I might still be in that kitchen, waiting for a birthday card that was never going to come." I walked out of the prison and into the crisp night air. My driver was waiting, the black car a silent symbol of the life I had built for myself. As we drove back toward the city, the lights of the skyline began to appear, a shimmering grid of possibilities. I thought about the pink envelope with the silver butterflies. It hadn't been a weapon of destruction. It had been a key. It had unlocked the door to the life I was meant to live. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. There was a message from Marcus. "Dinner is ready. Come home." I smiled and put the phone away. I wasn't an embarrassment. I wasn't a service girl. I was Jennifer Walsh, and I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The story of my life was finally being written by the only person who ever had the right to tell it. Me. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.